have been on the topic of governance and political processes in West Africa and governance and security challenges in Africa. Today, we are discussing governance and electoral processes in Africa. In the context of our topic, I would like to emphasize that, as set in Aspiration 3 of Agenda 2063, the key to Africa's political and economic transformation is an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect of human rights, justice, and the rule of law. Our concept note for this session is based on the observation that while the holding of elections is an integral part of the foundation of a democratic state, the very act of holding elections does not in itself establish their credibility or even the state of a country's democracy. In order to be credible, elections must instead be part of a broader political framework based on good governance, the rule of law, and equal participation of all citizens in political life. Although Africa has 55 states, the continent as a whole has made substantial progress recent decades, both normatively and institutionally, and on the ground. However, many challenges remain. We have today 3 international experts to share their views on the achievement and challenges at the same time. Francis Gabriel has been head of the ECOWAS Electoral Assistance Program since 2006. He is also the permanent secretary of the network of national electoral management structures in West Africa. As an accredited bridge facilitator, he is often invited to elections in Africa and in the state. He will provide an overview of the election while addressing the institutional challenges of ECOWAS and the EU. Priva Hangandou est titulaire d'un doctorat en politique publique de la Johnson Shaw Hama Graduate School of Public Policy, je m'excuse de la prononciation, de l'Université de Saskatchewan, et d'une maîtrise en sciences politiques ainsi que d'une licence en philosophie. Il a servi pendant plusieurs années comme conseiller politique et de gouvernance au département d'État américain et comme consultant auprès de la Banque africaine de développement. Il se penchera sur les facteurs structurels réels qui déterminent les processus électoraux et sur le rôle du pouvoir judiciaire dans les contentieux électoraux en Afrique. Comme nous le savons, c'est un problème sérieux en matière électorale en Afrique. Toussaint est le directeur exécutif adjoint de Canadem. Il a rejoint Canadem en 2007 et il est présentement responsable aussi de la gestion, du recrutement et du déploiement des experts de terrain à des postes à travers le monde. Il est spécialisé dans la gestion des programmes de la coordination des déploiements de réponse aux crises avec les missions sur le terrain des Nations Unies et des ONG nationales. Et il a également participé avec Canadem à la mise en place de plusieurs déploiements de missions d'observation électorale en coopération avec le Bureau des institutions démocratiques et des droits de l'homme de l'Organisation pour la sécurité et la coopération en Europe, et également avec l'Organisation des États américains, avec l'Union européenne, le Centre Carter. Il va nous briefer sur la contribution ou l'expérience canadienne à travers Canadem en matière d'assistance et d'observation électorale. Je voudrais attirer l'attention sur le fait que notre session est bilingue et je demande donc aux participants de bien vouloir poster leurs questions dans le box des questions et réponses en français ou en anglais et nous prendrons soin de transmettre cela à nos intervenants. Sans trop tarder, je crois que je vais passer la parole à notre premier intervenant, qui va être M. Francis Gabriel, le chef du programme d'assistance électorale de la CEDEAO depuis 2006. I will pass the floor to Mr. Gabriel, who is the head of ECOWAS Electoral Assistance Program since 2006. Vous avez la parole, Gabriel.
Merci beaucoup, M. Cheickh. Je voudrais vous remercier de m'avoir associé à cet échange sur la gouvernance et le processus électoraux en Afrique. Je voudrais intervenir sur 3 points. Je vais d'abord faire un petit historique de la source d'où nous sommes venus pour parler de démocratie en Afrique de l'Ouest et dans les pays africains. Ensuite, je vais faire un peu le point de la situation réelle qui existe actuellement en matière d'élections dans la sous-région ouest-africaine. Et je vais vous parler enfin du rôle que la CEDEAO joue dans les processus électoraux et pourquoi la CEDEAO, qui est une communauté d'intégration économique, s'est vue obligée d'intervenir en matière électorale. Alors, sur ceci dit, vous savez, la gouvernance et les processus électoraux, ça a pris départ surtout, son aspect dit démocratique a pris départ après les conférences nationales de 90 en Afrique et dans la région ouest-africaine. Alors, après ces différentes conférences, la plupart des pays, des États membres, ont adopté un système de pluralisme politique, c'est-à-dire système démocratique, car ils estiment que la vague de coups d'État, ça suffit, il faudrait maintenant que le pouvoir limite le pouvoir, comme l'a dit Montesquieu dans l'esprit des lois. Alors, ce faisant, les gouvernants se sont dit, depuis les indépendances, c'était un organe gouvernemental qui organisait les élections, c'est-à-dire les ministères. Mais pour plus de transparence, il faudrait confier l'organisation des élections à des structures neutres et que la plupart, certains appellent commission nationale autonome et certaines commissions nationales indépendantes pour organiser les élections. Et c'est là que je voudrais vous dire que depuis un moment, et en Afrique de l'Ouest, nous avons connu 3 sortes de commissions électorales indépendantes ou autonomes. Nous avons des commissions techniques, nationales techniques. Nous avons des commissions, c'est les commissions nationales techniques. Je peux citer la commission du Cap-Vert, je peux citer la commission du Ghana, par exemple. Nous avons des commissions nationales électorales qui sont purement politiques, et c'est le cas au Niger, en Guinée, par exemple. Et nous avons des commissions nationales mixtes, composées d'aussi bien de techniques que de politiques. Donc, voilà un peu dans quel environnement nous fonctionnons. Et qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? Et après la décision de l'amorce du processus démocratique, il fallait des institutions pour gérer et pour se contrôler. C'est ainsi que la plupart des pays ont une assemblée, ils ont l'exécutif qui est contrôlé qui devrait être contrôlé par une assemblée, et il y a des cours constitutionnels pour juger de la constitutionnalité des actes. Il y a même des institutions de contrôle et de régulation des médias. Mais malgré tout ça, quel est le défi qu'on trouve? C'est-à-dire qu'au lieu de prendre leur indépendance et de prendre leur pouvoir, la plupart de ceux qui gèrent ces institutions se voient redevables à ceux qui les ont nommés. Et ça affaiblit les institutions. C'est pour ça que vous voyez dans certains pays des décisions qui sont controversées et l'opposition est dans une position de toujours contredire les élections parce qu'il y a un manque de confiance. Ensuite, nous pouvons dire que la situation actuelle dans la région africaine et surtout en Afrique de l'Ouest que je suis, nous voyons que nous sommes confrontés à certaines modifications de constitution. Et c'est des modifications que la plupart des gens qualifient d'opportunistes. Parce que nous, au fil des ans, les dirigeants, quand elles se trouvent en fin de mandat, estiment qu'ils peuvent modifier la Constitution et déclenchent le mécanisme et qui est souvent prévu par leurs tests légaux. Ils déclenchent pour modifier la Constitution. Et ceci, c'est surtout les pays francophones. Parce que la plupart des pays anglophones de la zone ouest africaine, nous n'avons pas connu de modification opportuniste de constitution jusque-là. Alors, dans cette situation, nous avons constaté que cette décision de multipartisme a conduit dans la plupart des pays à une multiplicité de partis politiques. Alors, et ce n'est plus un regroupement d'idées, ce n'est plus un regroupement de programmes qui donne lieu à la création des partis, mais plutôt des affinités. Et ça fait que la situation actuelle, certains pays tentent de trouver des solutions pour régler ces solutions, dès lors qu'elles ne sont pas discutées par la plus grande partie des acteurs, et ces solutions ne sont pas acceptées de part et d'autre. C'est pour ça que dans certains pays, comme le Sénégal, on a initié la question de parrainage citoyen, et qui a eu des difficultés. Au Bénin aussi, il y a eu le parrainage des élus qui a connu des difficultés. Et en Côte d'Ivoire, il y a eu des questions de parrainage aussi. Donc, tout ça, c'est que le gouvernement veut clarifier le milieu politique. Mais le problème, c'est qu'il faut une discussion, une large discussion pour convenir à ce qu'il faut, aux conditions de réduction du nombre de partis, par exemple. Nous, au début aussi des années 90, nous avions une société civile qui était solide et qui essayait de tampon pour contrôler et surveillait même le processus électoral. Mais de nos jours, cette société civile est affaiblie dans la plupart de nos pays et je ne veux pas aller plus loin. Donc, dans cet environnement que la CEDEAO a créé la division assistance électorale, le programme d'assistance électorale en 2006. Ceci est parti des élections présidentielles au Togo, où la CEDEAO a joué un rôle très contesté. Donc, les bailleurs, les partenaires ont dû conseiller à la CEDEAO de recruter des experts pour créer une division assistance électorale dans la direction affaires politiques. Et c'est comme ça que j'ai joint la CEDEAO depuis 2006. Alors, quel est le rôle de la CEDEAO? La CEDEAO intervient en matière du processus électoral sur la base du protocole additionnel sur la démocratie et la bonne gouvernance. Et ce protocole est additionnel au protocole de gestion des conflits qui est de 1999. Donc, les chefs d'État se sont dit, mais nous avons un protocole de gestion des conflits. Mais vu la crise qu'il y a eu en Sierra Leone et au Libéria, ils ont constaté que la plupart des conflits viennent des élections mal organisées ou des élections mal acceptées, des résultats mal acceptés. Donc, ils se sont dit il faudrait intégrer un volet processus électoral, d'assistance au processus électoral par la CEDEAO. Et c'est ainsi que dans le protocole additionnel, la CEDEAO intervient pour assister les États. Et de quelle assistance s'agit-il? Il s'agit aussi bien de l'assistance technique, de l'assistance logistique, de l'assistance financière que d'assistance en matière de déploiement d'observateurs électoraux. Et c'est ça qui fait plus la visibilité de la CEDEAO de nos jours. Cette assistance, nous pouvons dire que cette assistance est une assistance d'accompagnement surtout, d'accompagnement et de prévention de conflits. Donc, avant de porter assistance, avant tout déploiement, le protocole exige au président de la commission de la CEDEAO de déployer une mission préélectorale qui rencontre tous les acteurs et fait une évaluation du processus et fait des recommandations sur la nature de l'assistance à accorder à ces pays. C'est ainsi que nous avons eu en 2007 à apporter une assistance logistique à la Sierra Leone et pour déployer le matériel électoral. Nous avons, depuis 2007, nous apportons de l'assistance financière à des pays qui ont des difficultés financières pour organiser les élections et nous apportons aussi des assistances techniques. Et en Guinée, par exemple, nous avons déployé des experts en matière d'enregistrement sur les listes électorales. Les listes électorales. Ce fut le cas aussi au Niger, parce que la liste électorale étant la base de la crédibilité du processus électoral, et quand il y a un doute sur la liste, les acteurs politiques font recours à un audit international pour départager. C'est pour ça que la CEDEAO de plus en plus déploie des missions d'audit. Donc, en dehors de ces missions, la CEDEAO aussi a un rôle de médiation dans les processus électoraux. Et ce rôle est joué surtout par les chefs de mission que nous déployons. C'est pour ça que pour le choix du chef de mission, il faut voir sa capacité et surtout voir parmi les anciens chefs d'État, ceux qui ont quitté démocratiquement le pouvoir et qui n'ont pas tenté d'étendre Je pense que j'ai encore quelques minutes. Je ne sais pas, je vous vois regarder la montre. J'ai encore quelques minutes. Donc,
allez-y, vous avez encore quelques minutes.
Quand il y a des crises, nos chefs de mission sont obligés de faire de la médiation, de rencontrer les acteurs pour baisser la tension. Ce fut le cas dans plusieurs pays. Et maintenant, le problème que les gens nous demandent, nous posent, c'est que la plupart des acteurs nous disent, et des analystes nous demandent, pourquoi la CEDEAO priorise la paix à l'aspect technique d'organisation des élections. Alors, ce que nous répondons souvent, nous disons que quand il n'y a pas la paix, rien ne peut se passer dans un pays. S'il y a la guerre ou s'il y a des tensions, tout est bloqué. Donc, il vaut mieux préserver la paix pour pouvoir discuter et permettre aux acteurs d'avoir une plateforme saine de discussion. Donc, c'est ce que nous essayons de faire, mais il est évident que dans la plupart des pays où les gens forcent en modifiant la Constitution, la question se pose. Mais quelles sont les limites de la CEDEAO? La CEDEAO, d'abord, la première limite, c'est la souveraineté des États. Quand les États vous imposent la souveraineté, que ce soit l'Union africaine, la CEDEAO, vous êtes obligés de respecter leur souveraineté. Et c'est ça la grande limite des actions de la CEDEAO. Et quand moi, personnellement, j'interviens avec les collègues, maintenant, je dis, est-ce qu'il n'est pas nécessaire de nos jours de revoir l'intervention des institutions internationales dans les processus électoraux pour être plus efficaces? Parce que de plus en plus, les populations se demandent quel rôle nous jouons, puisque c'est comme si nous arrivons et nous plébiscitons ou nous supportons ceux qui sont au pouvoir parce qu'ils estiment que nous n'avons pas un pouvoir pour agir sur le processus électoral. Nous n'avons pas un pouvoir parce que nous sommes limités dans notre rôle qui est de juger par rapport aux tests qui existent. Mais quand le test à l'origine est déjà contesté par une partie de la population ou une partie des acteurs, il est difficile, dans le rôle de la CEDEAO, de s'opposer à la souveraineté du pays. Et c'est ce challenge qui est, pour moi, un des plus importants, en dehors du challenge de sécurité, sécurité sanitaire et les autres challenges de sécurité qui sont dans le Sahel. La sécurité sanitaire, je peux évoquer ça brièvement parce que ça a beaucoup affecté l'organisation des élections en 2020, si bien qu'on se demandait si les 5 pays qui devaient organiser les élections vont pouvoir tenir leur calendrier. Mais apparemment, concrètement, les 5 pays ont tenu leur calendrier, mais avec des dégâts parce que, si je peux prendre l'exemple de l'ancien président de la commission électorale de Guinée, qui est décédé parce que les élections ont été organisées en temps de Covid. Nous n'avons pas de statistiques précises sur les conséquences d'organisation d'élections en matière de Covid pour apprécier, mais nous savons que ça a causé beaucoup de dégâts. Et comme il y a un manque de statistiques, il est difficile d'affirmer, mais le constat est là et la réalité est là. Donc voilà ce que je peux dire brièvement. Je pense qu'avec les questions, nous allons pouvoir approfondir et pour ne pas prendre trop de temps. J'espère que je n'ai pas dépassé les 15 minutes. Et merci pour m'avoir permis de m'exprimer. Je vous remercie et je suis disponible pour toute question parce que nous sommes habitués aux questions et nous savons ce que nous rencontrons quand nous faisons les conférences dans notre région. Donc, je reste ouvert. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Mr. Okay, and I trust that we will receive a question, and then you will have the opportunity, of course, to deepen your explanations. Priva, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Cheickh. And thank you, Francis, for setting the ground. Really rich presentation there. So I'm going to be talking about the role of institutions in electoral democracy in Africa. And specifically, I would like to address myself to the case of the judiciary in the advancement of democratic elections on the continent. And I chose that topic because my current research with one of my co-authors, Dr. O'Brien Kaba in Zambia, the University of Zambia, we are looking at how institutions of democracy, institutions like the electoral management bodies, the national police, national registration bodies behave in the advancement of democratic elections on the continent. So this presentation specifically looks at the role of the judiciary in determining electoral disputes and how this impacts democracy in Africa. Okay, so electoral disputes are very common in Africa, as they are in other parts of the world. Obviously, we just witnessed a very momentous dispute in the United States and in the last few months, even ongoing as we speak. In Nigeria, for instance, all presidential elections since the return to civilian rule in 1999 have been disputed until 2015, when President Goodluck Jonathan peacefully conceded defeat. And in Zambia, all observer missions in the 2001 election, both local and international, and Francis has spoken a bit about observer missions there. We can discuss more. There are some issues of concerns there, obviously. But in 2001, the local and international electional observer missions in Zambia concluded that elections were far from being free and fair. In fact, in that year, the European Union, the EU, took a very rare stand and waived the immunity of the head of the observer mission, Mr. Michael Meadowcroft, to testify in the courts of law for the opposition in the ensuing electoral petition. In Uganda, we just witnessed a very contentious election disputed by the opposition, who later withdrew the court case, not because there was no merit to their claim, but because they feared that the process would not be credible for them. So where elections have been assailed by anomalies and results have been disputed in Africa, aggrieved parties always look to the judiciary as an institution of last hope to seek redress. Okay, so and in almost all African countries, post-election disputes are entrusted to the judiciary. The only difference here seems to be the stage at which the judiciary gets involved, or where the litigants first go in the process, in the hierarchy of the judiciary. In countries like Nigeria, Namibia, and Kenya, and here I'm very specific to Kenya, before the 2010 constitution came into effect, cases begin at lower courts and are appealed ultimately to the Supreme Court. And in other countries such as Ghana, Zambia, Kenya, and Uganda, and Kenya here after the 2010 constitution, presidential election petitions are heard directly by the Supreme Court. And when they are determined at that level, there's no appeal, because the Supreme Court is the court of last appeal. You can't go anywhere else. Tanzania, to my knowledge, and my condolences if there are any colleagues from Tanzania on the loss of their president yesterday. Tanzania, to my knowledge, is the only African country with a constitutional provision that takes away the jurisdiction of the judiciary from hearing challenges to presidential elections. The Tanzanian constitution clearly states, and I quote, "When a candidate is declared by the Electoral Commission to have been duly elected in accordance with this article, then no court of law shall have any jurisdiction to inquire into the election of that candidate." End of quote. So it's very clear that, you know, once the commission declares you as a president, you have won, you go away with the victory. Now, the judiciary has determined or decided presidential election disputes in Africa in a very common way. There's a pattern that you see across the continent. And in my view, this pattern, you know, it stifles the growth of democracy on the continent. And this pattern, in all cases except two outliers that we can mention here, the Kenyan Supreme Court case decision of 2017 and the Malawi's High Court decision of 2019, both of which, you know, in my view, exercised outstanding courage in annulling or in nullifying the presidential elections of those years. And beyond those outliers, there are patterns that we can derive from how election petitions are decided in Africa. And the first point is that they are decided in favor of the status quo or the incumbent. The second point is that many cases are dismissed on flimsy technical and procedural rules without consideration of the merits of the litigants, of people that bring the cases to court. And the third is that there is the misuse of what is called the substantial effect rule to uphold defective elections. And the fourth point is that there are delays in determining elections, and this you see across the continent. And I'm going to give examples to this. And the fifth point is that judges very frequently refrain from making any reasonable decisions. Okay, so one could argue that that in Africa, on the continent of Africa, you know, the judiciary has been complicit in the delay of the consolidation of democracy or electoral democracy from the point of view of adjudication of electoral disputes. Okay, let me address myself to the first point, that all cases are decided in favor of the incumbent candidate or the candidate who is sponsored by the ruling party or the presumptive winner, in other words. This is very common. It's a very common trend in Africa. And the argument by many judges in cases that you know, you can look at have frequently been that you know, judges have a role to ensure political stability rather than deciding cases fairly according to facts presented before them or in line with the applicable law. For example, in the judgment following the petition to Ghana's December 2012 elections, the Supreme Court said, and I quote, "For starters, I will state that the judiciary in Ghana, like its counterparts in other jurisdictions, does not readily invalidate a public election, but often strives in public interest to sustain it." That was a ruling that came from the Supreme Court of Ghana. So striving to uphold an election is not a judicial role. It's a political decision. So this means that even before the case is presented, the judiciary is only prepared to preserve the election results that have been announced. And as a result, any discrepancies are most likely to be explained away as inconsequential. Except in the case of Cote d'Ivoire in 2010, we saw that the court ruled against the Independent Electoral Commission but without hearing the merits of the case. They dismissed the case without hearing the merits of the case. And this, of course, goes against the rule of law and democracy, because adjudication is ideally meant to offer litigants a formal method of taking part in the decision making of the court through presenting of their evidence and reasoned arguments for the decision, for a decision to be in their favor. So the second point I would like to stress here is that many cases are dismissed on minor procedural technicalities without consideration of the merits. When people submit their conflicts to a court of law, they do so in order that the courts may look at the merits without being unduly fettered by technicalities and have the cases decided fairly after consideration. So judges therefore have a duty to do substantive justice. In Africa, very often presidential petitions have been struck out by courts on what I would call curable technical grounds, without considering merits of the case. Okay, and when an aggrieved petitioner is sent away from a court without consideration of the merits, this often shatters their confidence in the justice system. It also negates both the rule of law and the consolidation of democracy. And the cases are many. I'll cite just two here. The Mwai Kibaki versus Daniel Arap Moi case of 1997 in Kenya. The Rally for Democracy and Progress and others versus the Electoral Commission of Namibia. We can discuss this in greater detail later on. The Electoral Commission of Zambia versus the United Party for National Development in 2016 in Zambia. We can discuss that later on. Okay, so that's the second issue of dismissing elections or disputes on technicalities without actually giving audience to the litigants to present their merits or demerits of the case. The third point here is that there is a misuse of the substantial effect rule. So every election has challenges. There's no perfect election, okay? And mistakes are bound to happen. Some mistakes are minor, some are unintended, but others are as a result of fraud or corruption or manipulation. In the 2019 Malawi elections, for example, the High Court ruled that the use of TPEX to correct figures or numbers on a form, they amounted to something substantive and suspicious, and therefore there were sufficient grounds for them to determine that the case was manipulated. So when courts are faced with an election petition, there's a need for a legal device or mechanism whereby they will determine which irregularities are minor and inconsequential and which are significant and in need of redress. The substantial effect rule does exactly this. And for many Anglophone African countries, this is an old rule that was inherited from the British system, the English legal system. The idea here is that is that flimsy mistakes, omissions, and commissions should not lead to the annulment of an election, provided that overall the fairness of an election was not vitiated. So the substantial effect rule, has worked in the most of disingenuous ways in Africa to uphold elections that are fraught with major irregularities and fraud. And examples are plenty. We can look at the example of Kizza Besigye versus Yoweri Museveni, Kaguta Museveni of 2006 in Uganda, the Anderson Kambela Mazuka case versus Levi Manawasa, Patrick Manawasa of 2001 in Zambia. So that's the third characteristic that stands out when you look at the trajectory of decisions made on the African continent in terms of presidential elections. And even you can go down to parliamentary elections, the dynamics will be different. The fourth point I'd like to make is in some countries, the resolution of disputes is inordinately delayed so as to render the whole process negatory or just academic. So an effective judicial system here for the determination of election disputes should not only be fair, but it must be timely and efficient. Many African countries, many African states allow the swearing in of the president upon declaration of the results without waiting for the resolution of election disputes by the courts. In Nigeria, for example, President Olusegun Obasanjo proceeded to be sworn in the 2003 election, despite a court order restraining him and his running mate from presenting themselves for swearing in, pending the determination of the substantive election petition. In Zambia, for example, again, until the constitution of the constitution amendment 2016 numbers 1 and 2, before that came into effect, there was an article in the constitution, article number 34(9), which required the president who had been declared the winner to be sworn into office and assume office immediately and no later than 24 hours after the declaration. So then the dispute of that election will be rendered academic, in other words, and you can discuss the dynamics of that. So where a president-elect is sworn in, even before the election disputes are settled by the courts of law, the need for an efficient resolution of cases becomes even more sensitive. The element of time is inherent in the concept of democracy and fair adjudication. So making the judicial system or justice itself a very time-bound concept. Let me give you examples here. Zambia's 2016 constitution requires, in terms of good examples, there are some good examples on the continent. It's not all very bad. I mean, there are certain good outstanding examples. Zambia's 2016 constitution now requires the determination of election within 14 days. That provides a window within which the constitutional court must determine the outcome of an election. In Uganda, the law requires the hearing and determination of a presidential election dispute to be finalized within 30 days of presentation of that petition. And we just witnessed the 2021 election. It was disputed. The Uganda Supreme Court in 2001 and 2006, it managed the disputes within the set limit of the constitution, which is a very good thing. In Kenya, the 2013 election petition and indeed the 2017 election petitions were managed within the time limit of the constitution. So they are good examples, and they must be emulated and probably replicated across the continent. Okay, there are, however, still several countries where cases are habitually delayed, rendering the whole adjudication process an exercise in futility. In Nigeria, for example, it is estimated that a presidential election petition takes about 2 years to finalize in Nigeria, which is actually half the presidential tenure. In Zambia, Zambia perhaps has the poorest record of inefficiency in the adjudication of presidential elections. The presidential election dispute that arose in 2001 elections, for example, was only finalized in 2005, just about a year before another general election. So the determination of election petitions where a candidate has been sworn in presents numerous challenges, and we can discuss those. I'm not going to dwell onto that now. I'll just move very quickly to the very last point, which is that judges simply fail to address issues presented before them by constraining themselves from making appropriate decisions. So courts sometimes refrain from making meaningful decision or simply defer to the executive instead of making a final binding determination. Again, I'll give an example from Nigeria. In the Nigerian case of Buhari, for example, the losing candidate, President Buhari, sought and was granted an injunction by the court restraining President Obasanjo and his running mate from presenting themselves for swearing into office pending the determination of the election petition. The respondents, in the violation of the court order, went ahead and were sworn in, and when the applicants appealed to the Supreme Court for determination whether the president had been validly sworn in or when it was done in violation of a valid court order, the Supreme Court determined, it held that the appeal was no longer relevant since the respondents had already been sworn in. Okay, so completely avoiding making a decision to either reverse the election or to determine whether the president had been elected validly. So the injunction would only be done, they argued, if we granted you the injunction, it would be an academic exercise without any effect on the status quo. And in Zimbabwe, in 2008, the Zimbabwe election is another example of self-imposed impotence of the judiciary. Following the 29th March 2008 election, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, ZEC, delayed announcing the results, prompting the opposition Movement for Democratic Change, MDC, to seek an order of the court compelling ZEC or the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission to release the results. And the judge at that point, Judge Uchenna, accepted that the delay had been inexplicable and unjustified. And so there are many examples. So you see a very, very consistent pattern across the continent. And obviously, like I said, there are some good examples that we can emulate and replicate across the continent. I think I'm close to or beyond my time. I'll stop there and pass the baton back to Cheickh. Thanks, Cheickh.
Thank you so much, Priva, for this excellent presentation. From your both presentation, the challenges highlighted include political intolerance, lack of inclusiveness, inadequacy of electoral management bodies, and post-electoral violence, as well as what we will call electoral inconsistency in dispute resolution, as well as the eroding terms limit in Africa that both of you characterize as a disconcerting trend. Those are real issues, and I believe that we are receiving them some question on those issues, but we will address those questions after the presentation that is going to be made by Dusan. Dusan, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Cheickh. Thank you, everyone, for attending this CIC session. I was invited by our CIC colleagues to shed some light on the Canadian contribution to the electoral observation. I work for Canada. We are not part of the government of Canada, though we have been created originally by the government of Canada. And we have been premier partner of the government to deploy electoral observers on behalf of Canada. Canada has been funding electoral observation missions for the past 40 years or so. There are generally two streams of funding for electoral observers. One for deploying regular Canadians to observe elections is an act of public diplomacy where Canadians would have a unique chance to present their country abroad, which is where Canada was involved. And the second is for deploying sitting members of parliament. These are the parliamentarians that deploy as part of the parliamentary observation missions along with their colleagues, generally as part of the multilateral missions. The first one for deploying regular Canadians has sustained significant changes in the recent times and has changed and morphed in many different ways. The second one remained the same for the past 40 years and has received stable funding because it is done through Parliament of Canada. This is one of the perks that parliamentarians have, that then when they get elected to Parliament, they can go and observe elections. So underlying rationale for electoral observation is basically based on the theory that the physical presence of the international observation missions will deter election fraud and encourage more peaceful voting, and then would lead to a more democratic societies. Global Affairs Canada did identify this as one of their core mandates, promoting freedom and democracy, human rights, and rule of law. And international election observation missions are really recognized as an important aspect, as my predecessors have mentioned. Canada started being involved in election observation missions in 2002 when we signed our first 5-year framework agreement. This was renewed twice, so we held an all-encompassing election observation agreement with the government of Canada that was used to deploy election observers both for bilateral and multilateral election observation missions. In the period of 10-12 years until 2004, we have deployed close to 2,000 election observers to some 120 observation missions. Generally, these are being deployed to partner organizations. So for elections in South America, these observers would go to the Organization of American States. For elections in Europe and former Soviet Union, they would go to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And for elections in Africa, they would go to the European Union multilateral observation missions. We have also staffed bilateral election observation missions. These are much more rare than the multilateral ones, simply because these are done on a special occasion in very selected few countries because they're very expensive and are difficult to do. So we have done these both in Haiti and in the Ukraine. So last deployment that we had in Africa, I went to our database and looked at the figures, and last deployment we had in Africa was in 2012. And so, you know, I tried to see, if we look at different explanatory lenses to try to understand why Canada sends these electoral observers, how can we see if they will be willing to assist drive for democracy in Africa by supporting electoral processes, because they haven't been doing it for the past 10 years. And so, generally speaking, from the data that I saw, we do have this large database of experts that is at the core of Canada. From the data that I see, generally, election observation missions funded by Canada are funded for 3 broad reasons. One, because international election observation missions are seen as a tool for promotion of norms, so for ideological reasons. Because elections are considered a key marker of democracy, and the government of Canada expressed its commitment to democracy as a core Canadian value. And so for some, supporting the advance of democracy is in Canadian interest in the same way as the spread of international human rights norms and the rule of law. And so from this perspective, national interest of Canada is shaped in part or in full by norms which Canada has engaged to uphold and promote. And so this started with the end of the Cold War and has continued for a while. And so this would be one reason why government of Canada would support this. Second reason is basically international electoral observation missions as a tool of foreign policy. This is not debated openly with with our counterparts in the government, because it is seen as more of a blunt force instrument. So, you know, from a realist point of view, basically election observations and democracy promotion may, you know, well meet certain objectives, you know, such as, you know, changing receiving states' preferences, you know, by harnessing Canada's relative power through the use of conditionality. So if you're trying to move a country from one place to the other in terms of foreign policy, the best case for that is again Ukraine, because you know, Ukraine and Russia are having issues, and you know, in 2004 they had these infamous elections that were stolen, and Canada basically used election observation as a foreign policy tool, where they sent this massive bilateral electoral observation mission on a short notice, very quickly started at great cost, because it was seen in interest of Canada to do so. The third explanatory lens for election observation missions from a Canadian perspective, and I find the most interesting one, is basically use of election observation missions as a tool in domestic electoral politics. We send election observers abroad because it is good for us, for political parties in power. So when I look at the data of all election observation missions sent, 92% of them were sent as part of the, you know, multilateral commitment. So, you know, to places like Africa, 24, or Europe and former Soviet Union, close to 60. However, these 92% of the missions had only 15% of all the observers. Because what would happen would, you know, if there is an election in Burundi, we would send 2 observers or 3 observers. But if there is an election in Ukraine, we would send 500 observers, which skews the numbers quite a bit. So you know, if I review the roster database dataset, out of the 85 missions organized by Canada, only 5 were bilaterally agreed in the last 15 years. Canada has a particular interest in Ukraine and Haiti, so 84% of everybody that we have deployed was to one country, Ukraine. 8% were to Haiti, and Africa is very low at 3%. Now, this might be a challenge for any kind of argument that we should be sending election observers to Africa, but I don't think it's the one that is impossible to overcome. That's all I have to say. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Susan. Dusan, I'm sorry, I say Susan. Thank you so much, Dusan. I really appreciate your point of view, especially the fact that you are insisting on the importance of a Canadian presence in form of electoral observation in Africa, because that could be a very important factor to be present in the international activities in Africa. And I believe, I do remember as a former observer, I remember all the activities that Canada has been taking in Africa, especially in Burundi, and also in the RDC. And we hope that eventually that will come back, and the presence, Canada presence in Africa will be more effective in this sector. Thank you so much for your presentation. And we have many questions. I have tried to put them together. And one of the first questions that I have been successful in putting together is that since 2015, there has been 13 cases of African leaders extending their time in power beyond their mandated 2 terms. Of the 12 presidential elections held in 2020, 5 had incumbents facing term limits. Yet, in only 1 case, Niger's President Mahamadou Issoufou did the incumbent respect this limit. To what extent can these be considered as one of the obstacles to governance and credibility of elections in Africa, and by extension, major development security issue in Africa in general? The question is especially to Mr. Okay, but I will also ask the other panelists to address this question. It seemed to me to be a very pivotal issue.
Ouais, effectivement, cette question d'extension de mandat a commencé en 2015 et c'est un problème sérieux qui se pose. Et vous savez, comme je l'ai dit dans ma présentation, la CEDEAO, l'institution ECOWAS, c'est une institution d'État. Les membres sont des États membres. La vision est d'avoir la CEDEAO des peuples, mais actuellement, nous sommes encore à la CEDEAO des États. Premier élément. Ensuite, deuxième élément, vous avez la souveraineté des États qui s'impose et l'intervention de la CEDEAO, c'est par rapport aux lois internes de chaque État. En tant que staff de la CEDEAO, vous avez votre avis personnel, mais en tant que qui est différent de l'avis de l'institution. Mais vous n'êtes pas le... Donc, il y a un problème de qualité de leadership qui se pose dans notre région. Et un autre problème, c'est un problème de maîtrise de production des évidences, des preuves de ce que nous réclamons. Parce que si vous prenez par exemple une élection qui se passe, par exemple, dernière élection au Togo, un candidat dit « c'est moi qui ai gagné ». Quand tu dis que tu as gagné, c'est que tu as les moyens de prouver devant la juridiction que voilà, dans tel bureau de vote, tel bureau de vote, tel bureau de vote, tu as gagné. Mais nous nous confrontons la plupart du temps au manque de preuves de celui qui demande, celui qui réclame. Parce que d'abord, la plupart des candidats n'ont pas les moyens d'avoir des représentants sur toute l'étendue du territoire. Ils sont que représentés dans une partie de la capitale, défaut de moyens. Donc, il faudra peut-être agir à ce que les moyens soient égaux à tous les candidats. Mais est-ce que c'est possible? Ça aussi, c'est une question. La CEDEAO aussi est dans la réflexion sur ces différentes questions qui se posent sur l'extension, sur les changements constitutionnels. Et c'est des réflexions qui vont se poursuivre. Mais tant que les États seront souverains, je pense qu'il serait difficile à une institution africaine en plus de pouvoir agir sur ce qui se passe. Nous avons, par exemple, des observateurs de l'Union européenne, mais qu'est-ce qui donne les moyens du caractère impératif des conclusions de l'Union européenne? C'est parce que l'Union européenne, des fois, pose des conditions, des conditionnalités par rapport à l'appui qu'ils vont donner au pays. Et ça permet, par exemple, de faire fléchir le pays. Mais la CEDEAO, l'Union africaine, vous êtes des institutions où ces membres, des fois, c'est eux-mêmes qui désignent vos dirigeants. Alors, voilà la situation, et je suis entièrement d'accord qu'il y a un problème d'extension de mandat et tout, mais la question est très profonde et il faudra faire beaucoup de restructuration avant de pouvoir rendre plus efficaces les institutions pour ce genre de choses. Mais dès lors qu'il y a la souveraineté qui s'impose, je défie quiconque qui sera dans ces institutions de pouvoir bouger. Moi, voilà mon avis.
Oui, avant de continuer la discussion et de passer la parole aux autres, je voudrais quand même insister sur le fait que la souveraineté, le principe de la souveraineté, certes, c'est un principe universel, c'est un de base qui est inclus dans la Charte des Nations Unies et dans un certain sens qui relève peut-être du jus cogens. Mais pourront-on dire que ce principe de souveraineté permet ou alors constitue une sorte d'immunité pour les États pour violer l'état de droit et pour ne pas organiser des élections fiables dans des pays? Et pourquoi la CEDEAO, en tant qu'institution, ne s'oppose pas? Pourquoi elle ne s'oppose pas? Pourquoi elle ne fait pas des déclarations pour dénoncer tout au moins cet état de fait?
Nous faisons des déclarations, mais les déclarations ne suffisent pas. Ma propre fille m'a demandé, mais vous ne faites que des déclarations, qu'est-ce que vous faites? Mais c'est de cela qu'il s'agit. Nous constatons tous, vous pouvez techniquement faire un travail, mais tant que vous restez au niveau technique, vous ne pouvez pas le présenter. Il faut que ce soit validé par des supérieurs. Donc, c'est pour ça que j'estime que la société civile doit pouvoir jouer son rôle et compenser le vide que créent nos institutions. La CEDEAO est allée jusqu'à promouvoir et soutenir financièrement la société civile pour pouvoir combler ce vide. Et nous, à chaque année, une institution de société civile comme le WANEP a un soutien de la CEDEAO. Mais tant que les choses seront telles que c'est actuellement, il est difficile à une institution gouvernementale, ça c'est une vérité que je vous dis, d'agir comme la société civile. Les principes sont là, tout le monde voit que les principes sont bafoués, mais ceux qui doivent prendre la décision sont incapables, ils sont limités par la souveraineté de chaque État. Ça, c'est une réalité. C'est une réalité.
Est-ce qu'il serait correct à ce niveau de conclure que la CEDEAO n'a pas les moyens de ses ambitions?
Ça dépend de là où on se trouve. Parce que vous ne pouvez pas conclure quand la CEDEAO, dans certains pays, quand même, a réussi. Par exemple, en Gambie, la CEDEAO a réussi à faire imposer les principes démocratiques parce qu'il y avait une preuve, il y avait des résultats qui ont été donnés, reconnus, mais après, on a voulu se rebiffer. Donc là, la CEDEAO a les moyens de soutenir. Quand il y a des preuves, la CEDEAO peut foncer. Mais tant qu'il n'y a pas de preuves tangibles, et que ce n'est que des déclarations. J'ai gagné, je suis opposant, c'est moi qui ai gagné, mais on te demande les preuves, tu ne les as pas. C'est de ça qu'il s'agit.
Right. Priva, what is your take on this one? Maybe you can also try to talk to us about some progress that we have seen in Malawi, in Seychelles, in Ghana, where we have seen excellent rule of law taking over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Cheickh. I think that's a very good question. And I know it's always good to begin with the positives. We have seen some very good examples on the continent. Like you mentioned there, not just in Malawi, Ghana has had challenges, but it is all continuously presenting itself as a good example on the continent. Kenya has performed very well as well. There are other cases we rarely talk about because they are on the extreme end of the spectrum, like South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, really, really good examples. But I just wanted to answer very specifically what this removal of term limits, refusing of incumbents to come out of office, what it means for democracy. One of the best authors in democracy, in democratic governance, is a scholar from Latin America called Guillermo O'Daniel, and he presents 3 metrics for measuring democracy. These are, it's a spectrum, it's not a static point. He says you should look out for these qualities in a democracy. The first one is regular elections, and Cheickh mentioned this. It's just democracy is not just about regular elections, but they're important. It's important to have elections. The second thing is that the opposition have a real opportunity to form government. It means the political environment and atmosphere in that country is in such a manner that opposition are able to present their alternative thoughts about what they would do to run a government. They must have freedom of speech. They must have freedom of expression. They must be able to mobilize to move from one part of the country to the other. They must not be spending half of their time in prison because they're mobilizing their political support. So that's very, very important. And the third factor is that there must be effective civil society. Okay, so when a president takes away term limits, he completely obliterates all these three factors. He takes away all the three factors. There's not going to be regular elections. There's not going to be a real chance presented to the opposition. And there's civil societies usually present a critical voice, alternative voice representing the people. They're going to be, gagged as well. So that's very important to see. But so why do African, not all of them, and we have seen good examples. The number that was mentioned is very big. We can count the countries we know. I think it's Rwanda. In Zambia, currently, there is a debate about whether or not the president should be able to run. It's not a new debate, whether or not the president should run a third term. Does the constitution allow him to run again after he has held office 3 times? Or 2 times, will he be eligible for a third time of holding office? So I think the idea is why do we have these conversations at all? In my view, having worked in many African countries so far, and having done research in many African countries, the biggest problem is the fear of prosecution. When a government gets into office with a view of what another good book, why nations fail, Asemoglu and Robinson, the idea of extractive leadership, that you get into office to become rich, you get into office to abuse office, you get into office, it might not just be the president, it might be other functionaries below the president. And please understand that sometimes the president might even want to go himself, but the other people under him who have collectively or individually, but cumulatively looted the system, looted the government, looted the public coffers, they sustain a president, they sustain the status quo. They don't want him to leave because they're afraid of prosecution. So I think it's a combination of those factors: extractive leadership, and fear of what will come afterwards. Sometimes just, power is nice to have. I don't want to leave, and systems are porous. I've appointed judges that are pliable. Every state institution has, appointees for the president. So it's very easy to sustain such a decision of obliteration of term limits. But the consequences on democratization are very deep, extremely deep, and very difficult to reverse, as suggested in those 3 terms that I outlined earlier. But like Cheickh said, there are good examples. It's not all dark. There are very good examples that we can look at and say, why don't we replicate this in our own, in other parts of the continent?
Thank you very much, Priva. And I believe one of the good examples, do you think there was a institutional court ruling that changed Malawi's electoral system, replacing a first past the post model with one requiring an outright majority?
Yeah. So
do you think
so
this is a best practice sense?
So it's so the Malawi court decision, the High Court decision of Malawi in 2019, I think, 2019 was that part of the court ruling was not part of the initial litigation. They went beyond what was presented to them in the courts of law. What was presented to them was a dispute of the outcome of the election, whether or not the election had been validly held, considering the multiple, numerous, cases of irregularities. That was the substance of the matter. So when the case went to court, the court went above that and decided that the next election should be determined on a 50% plus 1 threshold, on more than 50% of the valid votes. That system exists in many countries in Africa. It exists in Zambia. and I think it exists in Kenya. That was the basis for the 2017 dispute, whether or not it should be, 50% of all the votes. If you remember the Uhuru versus Uhuru Kenyatta versus sorry, correct me. I forget the gentleman's name, but the basis of that dispute was: is it 50% of all the votes that have been cast, or is it 50% of the validly cast votes, excluding the damaged ballots? And Uhuru had won 50% of the entire vote and not 50% of the validly cast ballots. So that's why the dispute was. So the 50% threshold, in my view, is majoritarian. It provides a clear mandate to the winner. It's a very difficult threshold to achieve in many countries because there might be need for a rerun, but it does ultimately produce a president who is elected by the majority of the people, and I think it's a good system. It avoids the single majority, 10% of the total population of voters winning the vote. Because if you have a president who gets 10% of the votes and the other 90% is split across many parts by 8%, it presents a challenge. I think it's a very good system and it must be encouraged. But again, other systems have their own preferences, but I think this is a very good ruling by the High Court of Malawi, and it has helped Malawi to be an example of democracy in Africa this far. Yeah.
I should emphasize that Malawi was only the second African country to annul a presidential election after Kenya in 2017, and the first in which the opposition won the rerun. And that was a very important factor, I believe, in Africa. I will go now to maybe do some, based on your presentation, what will be the main factors to be considered in setting up and deploying an international election observation mission? Because in Africa, the issue in Africa is that sometimes the missions are present, but they are not efficient. And the efficiency of a mission is not to be implemented once they are on the field. It's something that is to be put in place in the preparation phase.
Well, this ties with a comment that Luis made in the chat box and Steve about the capacity building. Election observation missions have changed significantly from their beginnings in the 1990s. What originally was main focus was the election observation on the day of elections. Now that is only one significant, but only one part of the modern day election observation missions. The nature of the missions has changed in such way that the long-term component is now becoming more and more important. There has been, we have tried to push the government in the direction of moving it from the, event-driven programming to the electoral cycle approach, where, observing elections is one thing, but also initiating projects that would respond to the mission report recommendations. So if, the elections in Serbia in 2020 mentioned that there are these issues that have been identified, there is a follow-up funding by the government of Canada that would be following up on these, making sure that they have been taken in consideration and addressed prior to the next elections. That has not been the case so far. The election observations were done very much on the ad hoc basis. The only place where this has been significantly looked at and an election observation has been approached as a long-term exercise was, again, Ukraine, again, for political reasons. We would deploy, in the latest missions that we had to Ukraine, we would deploy a significantly large short-term component, but we also have a team of analysts that would be experts in anything from the election advertisement to security issues, to cybersecurity issues, to minority rights, to gender experts that would do gender analysis. So these are all components that previously didn't exist but have been added and been increasing in value over time. And this is both so that you can do a wholesome evaluation of the electoral process, but also to, in a sense, produce some kind of recommendations that will lead to a capacity development over long term.
Merci, Dusan. Merci beaucoup. Monsieur OK, je vais revenir vers vous pour d'abord vous remercier du travail que vous avez fait au Niger. Des élections électorales, l'observation électorale en Afrique de l'Ouest, c'est quelque chose qui n'existait pas avant. Présentement, grâce à la CEDEAO, on a un système électoral d'observation électorale qui est là, qui est coordonné et qui fait son travail pour autant qu'il puisse s'en acquitter dans les pays, quelquefois avec des situations difficiles. Que pensez-vous, si on vous demande de donner, disons, 3 points essentiels pour améliorer l'observation des élections en Afrique? Quels seraient ces 3 points? Et est-ce que vous pensez que la présence des observateurs à elle seule témoigne de la crédibilité des élections?
Merci beaucoup. L'observation, c'est une opération dissuasive. C'est une opération qui permet d'avoir un œil extérieur pour voir la conformité de ce qui se fait, d'abord avec les lois internes et les instruments internationaux. Si on s'entend sur ça, normalement, je peux vous le dire clairement, en tant que technicien et ancien de AIFES, les missions d'observation doivent être composées des gens qui maîtrisent quand même la matière. Donc, il faut d'abord déployer des gens compétents qui maîtrisent la matière. Ensuite, la durée. Parce que si vous déployez des gens pour une semaine, le jeu est déjà fait. Ils vont observer et ce qui se passe dans la semaine. Mais quand vous déployez des gens à long terme, et c'est ce que je m'efforce de faire comprendre, déployer d'abord des missions à long terme, et avant même des missions à long terme, un groupe d'analystes de core team qui vont préparer l'arrivée des missions à long terme, qui préparent l'arrivée des missions à court terme. Alors, si ce processus est respecté, moi je pense qu'on aura la qualité de rapport, la qualité de recommandation. Ensuite, il faudra dépolitiser les déclarations. Même si on a la contrainte de souveraineté, au moins avoir le courage de dire voici les limites de votre processus, il faudrait améliorer et faire des recommandations subséquentes. Moi, je pense que ces 3 niveaux-là, ça peut d'abord la compétence des observateurs, ensuite la durée, et 3e élément, de dépolitiser un peu les déclarations pour permettre une amélioration. Voilà mon avis en tant que expert en matière d'observation électorale.
Merci infiniment. Il nous reste encore 6 minutes. Et Dusan, what do you think? How do you see the future based on what Mr. OK just told us? How do you think the possibility of future presence of Canadian observation mission in Africa?
It will have to be at a fairly high political level, and the request made, and it would have to be tied to an issue that would have a longevity. Otherwise, it will be on an ad hoc, one-off basis. The only place that has managed to long-term interest Canadian bureaucracy in terms of election observations is Ukraine. And that is because there are 1.2 million Canadians who are of Ukrainian origin. And so they pay attention at it. In order for them to pay attention at elections in Africa, you know, there would have to be some kind of either momentous issue, like it was with, you know, apartheid South Africa in the first election when Ron Gould was involved and, you know, as a deputy election commissioner, and Brian Mulroney, the Prime Minister of Canada at the time, you know, put this at the top of his list of priorities. And so, you know, the money flowed. Anything after that, you know, it's unfortunate, but it's true that Africa is not the priority in terms of elections for Canada. They are much more so for, you know, current humanitarian issues. I can tell you that Canada at any given point in time has dozens, if not hundreds, of humanitarian experts all across Africa deployed to assist in search deployment. Anything from, you know, Ebola, current situation in, you know, Mozambique, you know, in Ethiopia. I mean, we have experts there, and they are being funded by government of Canada because they see this as being the priority for them. Elections are a long game, and they require a long-term commitment and funding to produce results. And so it's unfortunate, but it will have to come either from individual countries or, I would say, probably from African Union as a I would say premier organization.
From ECOWAS.
Or from ECOWAS, yes.
Okay. We still have 3 minutes. I just want to emphasize that according to the last report of Transparency International, leaders in countries where leaders have evaded term limits have been in power for 4 times longer on average than leaders in countries upholding term limits. Countries where leaders have avoided term limits, moreover, are rated as considerably more corrupt, according to Transparency International, as I say. And with these last words, I would like to thank all of you, our panelists, Monsieur Oke, Dusan, Priva, and I would like to thank our participants for being so, je dirais, fidèles à nos émissions, à nos programmes. We will continue discussing as we can. We will continue the discussion on governance and development issue in Africa. And we will continue to make sure that people understand what is going on. Merci à tous. Et Bruce, je vous repasse la lampe pour la dernière parole.
Bruce, microphone.
Je crois que votre microphone est éteint, Bruce.
Yes,
Ton microphone est éteint.
Thank you. I should know that by now. Anyway, thanks very much, all of you, for a very interesting set of presentations, and hope that you found it an interesting exercise. With luck, the recording has worked, and we will have it on our YouTube channel shortly, and we'll let you know about that. We're also, for those who are still listening, we will hopefully have our website back up and running by April, or by sometime in April anyway. So thank you very much. Take care, and it's sunny. It's not spring, but we're getting close. So take care, and all the best. Thank you.
All right.
Merci, OK.
Ouais, de rien. À bientôt.
On se parle, oui.